In 1980, Ronald Reagan became the 40th President of the United States after a tight race with Jimmy Carter.
When Mr. Carter or Mr. Mondale say they simply cannot balance the budget,
Reagan's gift for public speaking would eventually earn him the title, the Great Communicator.
I say, stand aside because we can and we will.
A major legacy of Reagan's presidency was his impact on defense and foreign policy.
We've learned by now that it isn't weakness that keeps the peace, it's strength. Our foreign policy has been based on the fear of not being liked. Well, it's nice to be liked, but it's more important to be respected.
Reagan was a staunch anti-communist who called the Soviet Union an evil empire. He felt threatened by the Soviet Union, which had 3 times as many missiles as the United States and more powerful nuclear warheads. Reagan asked Congress to approve a new missile system, the MX missile.
President Reagan took a major defeat tonight as the future of the MX missile went on the line in the House of Representatives.
After Congress voted down the system 3 times, Reagan began to look for a technology that could defend the United States against missiles instead. The answer seemed to lie with Dr. Edward Teller, the inventor of the hydrogen bomb. Teller proposed designing a laser weapon that could shoot down missiles from outer space before they ever reached the United States. Reagan, who wanted to protect the United States from the threat of nuclear missiles, immediately liked the idea. He quickly announced his plans for what he called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or SDI. Critics dubbed the system Star Wars. Soviet leaders worried about the possibility of the arms race continuing into space. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union had deployed intermediate-range missiles aimed at American allies in Western Europe. Officials at the North American Treaty Organization, NATO, responded by asking the United States to put cruise missiles and Pershing missiles in Europe. The European peace movement opposed this plan, however. The United States offered the Soviets what Reagan officials called the zero option. In this plan, no cruise or Pershing missiles would be deployed as long as the Soviet Union agreed to withdraw all its intermediate-range missiles. But Soviet leaders were unwilling to trade their missiles that were in place for American missiles they did not think would ever arrive. The Soviets were convinced that Europe's leaders would not allow the United States to place the missiles. They were wrong. NATO governments in Europe welcomed the American missiles. Now American missiles could reach the Soviet Union, but Soviet missiles could not reach the United States.
Vitinsky, can you tell us, did you walk out? It's all over.
The Soviets broke off arms control talks.
During which we have stated that the present round of the negotiations is discontinued.
At about this time, a new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, took power in the Soviet Union. Gorbachev promoted greater political openness in the Soviet Union and reforms aimed at improving the failing Soviet economy. 3 years had now passed since the idea of SDI was born. Despite billions of dollars of research, American scientists were no closer to bringing the defense system to life. However, the Soviet Union still feared the development of such a defense system and the strain that matching it would put on their economy. Gorbachev decided his country could not afford it. Gorbachev and Reagan met in Iceland.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning.
There, Gorbachev agreed to remove the Soviet intermediate-range missiles from Europe in exchange for the Americans pulling out the cruise and Pershing missiles. Reagan decided to raise the stakes. He suggested getting rid of intercontinental ballistic missiles altogether. Gorbachev was reluctant to agree. After all, these intercontinental missiles were the Soviet Union's greatest strength. He countered with another dramatic offer. He would agree to complete disarmament by the year 2000 if Reagan would limit SDI to laboratory testing. In essence, the proposal meant the destruction of Reagan's dream of an SDI system, since it would be impossible to test the shooting down of missiles in a lab.
We have an agreement, sir!
To Gorbachev, it was all or nothing. To Reagan, this meant it would have to be nothing.
I realize some Americans may be asking tonight, why not accept Mr. Gorbachev's demand? Why not give up SDI for this agreement? Well, the answer, my friends, is simple. SDI is what brought the Soviets back to arms control talks at Geneva and Iceland. SDI is the key to a world without nuclear weapons.
The president.
Reagan's position put Gorbachev in a bind. He felt he had to cut Soviet military spending in order to raise the standard of living in his country. The Soviet leader decided the time had come for both countries to get rid of all their intermediate missiles. In 1987, 6 years after Reagan first proposed the zero option, the United States and the Soviet Union signed a treaty agreeing to remove their intermediate missiles from Europe.
For the first time in history, the language of arms control was replaced by arms reduction, the complete elimination of an entire class of U.S. and Soviet nuclear missiles.
After the historic agreement, Gorbachev and his wife dined with the Reagans at the White House. The following spring, President Reagan returned Gorbachev's visit. The two men walked around Moscow, seemingly enjoying each other's company.
Do you still think you're in an evil empire, Mr. President? Why not?
I was talking about another time and another era.
In 1988, as Reagan approached the end of his presidency, Gorbachev came back to the United States to address the United Nations.
Today I can report to you that the Soviet Union has taken a decision to reduce its armed forces. Within the next 2 years, their numerical strength will be reduced by 500,000 men.
Gorbachev also promised to remove 6 tank divisions from their positions in Eastern Europe. Soviet forces also left Afghanistan in 1988 after years of fighting against American-trained anti-communist guerrilla fighters. Reagan acknowledged Gorbachev's attempt to reform the Soviet Union, but challenged him to go further. He gave a spirited speech in the shadow of the Berlin Wall, which symbolically divided the communist and democratic worlds of Eastern and Western Europe. In that speech, Reagan urged Gorbachev to tear down that wall. Just 2 years later, in 1989, communist governments began to collapse in Eastern Europe, and the Berlin Wall was indeed torn down. By 1991, communists had lost power throughout Eastern Europe, and communists had been ousted from power in the Soviet Union, which had broken up into 15 different republics. Reagan's dream of an anti-missile system was never realized, but Reagan and his policies had helped put an end to the Cold War and the threat of nuclear war. And they helped convert the Soviet Union from a bitter enemy into a peaceful friend.